So I'm here to talk to you guys about mobile first, and for me, mobile first is just a way to start thinking about building web products and services in the context of what's going on today with people's behaviors and with digital products in general. And by the way, can everybody hear me? Everything okay? Okay. So I'll try and give you guys a good amount of material here, but if you have any further questions or there's other things you want to talk about, I am on the Twitters. So you can ask me questions there, or you can contact me, and, or have you. So the idea here is pretty simple, and it's a little bit different from the way many of us are used to building out web products and services, because traditionally what happens is you sort of start with the desktop experience, and we've been doing this for years, and then maybe you'll get to building a mobile version a little bit later. Maybe you'll port things over to the mobile version. Maybe, right? It's not necessarily a guarantee. But I'm sort of contending, given some of the opportunities, the constraints, and the capabilities of the mobile platform now, it makes sense to do a mobile version first, even if you're not really planning to even launch a mobile version. It's a healthy process to go through, even though you don't have anything necessarily concrete on your roadmap of we're going to launch a mobile version here on this and this date. It's still a good thing to do. So the reason why I think this is it helps make your products better, and ultimately you can take those things back to the desktop or whatever other platform you do and work from there. So you don't have to take my advice for this. If you think I'm crazy, people like Eric Schmidt also are advocating this approach. This is from a recent keynote he gave where he says we're working mobile first because A, that's what programmers actually want to do. That's kind of what runs things at Google many times. But also he believes that the mobile phone is sort of this high volume endpoint, I want to make sure I got that quote right, of three things: computing power, connectivity, and also cloud-based resources. So things that are up in the cloud, you got a lot of computing power in small form factors, and all that stuff's connected to the network. And where that all kind of comes together throughout the entire day is the mobile phone. So it's a really interesting place to not only think about experiences, but think about the way you can create kind of an ecosystem of experiences. But don't just do things because Eric and I say so. There's actually concrete reasons why I think mobile first makes sense. The first one is it's growing like crazy, and I'll give you just a real short recap of that. I think everybody in this room probably is aware of the opportunity that mobile gives you. But it's not just an opportunity to ride out this next big growth of, next big wave of computing, but it's an opportunity to make your overall service and experience better through an integration of mobile. There's a number of constraints in designing for mobile that I think are just flat out good design, flat out good user experience, and flat out good for customers and companies. And in particular, things like small screens, slow connections, mobile context, all that stuff very much forces you to focus, and focus is usually a very good thing. I'm in the middle of creating a startup, and if another person says the word focus to me, I think my head will explode. But that's generally the feedback you get over and over and over and over again is focus, focus, focus. And I think there's good reasons for that. Last but not least, there's a lot of rich capabilities in a lot of the mobile platforms now that haven't made their way to the desktop yet, but allow you to do great things like isolate noise in the back room. Just kidding. So together, all these things make a compelling case for building for mobile first, and we'll talk about that in detail. But since I obviously think designing for mobile is important, I don't want to just tell you that it's important. I'm going to sprinkle in a whole bunch of design considerations and things to think about and resources for you about how to deal with screen sizes, performance, touch interactions, location, and capabilities. But the most important mobile design consideration out there is to just do what Adam says. Everybody familiar with this one? I'm kidding. Again, I joke. You guys hopefully don't mind the joking. Okay, so let's take a look at these opportunities. As I mentioned before, mobile is growing like crazy, and it's not just an opportunity to have a mobile version, but to have a better overall experience. So many times, those of us that have been in tech for a while know that many times people have said mobile is the next best big thing, but literally it's happening now. And if you look at some of the current numbers, in terms of web use, right, I think there's always been a big proliferation of mobile devices, and there's now, I think, more cell phones than credit cards. I recently saw a statistic that said teenagers are more likely to own a cell phone than to own a book, which is sort of scary. Both those things are a little scary. But most of those cell phones, when you think about feature phones, the experience of using the web was just awful. Has anybody tried to access the web on a feature phone? So yeah, good? No, terrible, right? So it wasn't really a web explosion and a network connectivity explosion. You know, people were basically sending SMS and doing voice. But right now, the mobile web is growing 8 times faster than the desktop web grew back in the AOL heydays, and smartphone sales next year are going to surpass PC sales. In other markets, this sort of reversal has already happened. A lot of markets are mobile first in that people come online through their mobile devices first, and then maybe they graduate up to a more permanent workstation or laptop kind of thing. And these kind of bubbles just indicate that each of these cycles, when we went to desktop internet, when we went from PC, when we go to mobile, this is kind of a 10x increase. Other data I can throw at you, heavy mobile data users are going to triple by 2013. Mobile data traffic is growing 108% by 2014, reaching 3.6 exabytes per month. So there's crazy stuff on here. If you're interested in any of this data, I've published a lot of this stuff on my blog. Send me an email. But key point here is a lot of activity happening online. And what's causing this? I sort of alluded to this earlier, but I think the number one thing that's causing this is the process of browsing the web on mobile devices doesn't suck anymore. And the kind of pinnacle moment here, I think, was back in June 29th, 2007, when Apple released the iPhone. And I'm not just saying that because I have a Mac laptop. I mean, I fundamentally believe before then the browser and the experience of using the web was just really bad, and so very few people did it. And these guys sort of set the bar, and now there's a lot of great phones that allow you to use the web efficiently, but this growth, and by the way, that the data sort of shows this, right? A 5,000% increase on the AT&T network in mobile traffic is a pretty big deal. And people say, well, what about smartphones versus feature phones? Statistically, smartphones and mobiles are already at 33% penetration in the US, and in the next couple of years, they're looking at things that are quote-unquote smartphones being up around 90% in the next about 3 years. So you can start to increasingly count on people having good mobile-capable devices. So it's not just ride out this growth, have something on mobile. It's also an opportunity to think about an overall experience for your users. So I like this quote by Brian Fling from his O'Reilly book on mobile design, where he says, don't just port things, create something interesting for mobile. And perhaps one of the best use cases of this comes from this man. Does anybody know who this is? Joe Hewitt. This is the guy that made this app. So the Facebook app and the Koi Pond app right now on a weekly basis fight for a #1 position in the Apple App Store. One time Koi Pond's winning, the other time Facebook takes over. Those are sort of the two most used applications on this platform. And when he went through this process, this is a quote I pulled from an article he wrote. You know, he originally was focused on a mobile companion, something that would complement the site, but quickly realized that he was actually able to create something that's better than the actual website. And I think this is one of the key points that I want to talk to with focus. Why can we use this platform to actually create something that's better? But one last thing I want to say with the opportunity in mobile is it's an additive opportunity. So what's happening with Facebook mobile is people that use Facebook on their mobile device are 50% more active on Facebook on the desktop than those that don't use the mobile version, right? So you're getting additional engagement through this platform as opposed to, it getting split up. Okay, so let's look at how these constraints and capabilities help you make this great experience that I'm talking about. And in particular, screen size, connection speed, and mobile context are the 3 things I want to talk about. So when you're designing for laptops, desktops, kind of the web as we've been familiar with for the past, 15 years or so, you're looking at, well, what's kind of the available screen space? And today, most people go for a 1024 by 768 as the room you have to work with, right? When you move to mobile, you've lost 80% of your canvas. Right? This is we'll talk about the different dimensions available on different phones and devices in a second, but on a typical phone, the first iPhone, the first Palms, and the first series of Android devices, 320 by 480 was pretty much the space you had to work with. So you just lost 80% of your canvas. What does that do to you? Well, it forces you to only use the stuff that's immediately apparent, right? So minimize the stuff, and really just focus on what people actually want to do. So examples of that, recently I flew on Southwest, and this was the Southwest website on the desktop. A lot of stuff going on, right? Later, I happened to open up Southwest on my mobile phone, and this is what I saw. Any differences? Let me show you that again. This versus this. Now, what's the difference? This thing is focused entirely on only the things I care about and want to do and nothing more. And coincidentally, these are the ways Southwest Airlines actually makes money. So it's better for the user, and it's ultimately better for the business. So here you can make airline reservations, car reservations, check your flight status. Here you can also do all those things, but man, it's a lot harder to get to that and even understand that that's what's available to you. Now, I'm not advocating making the desktop experience the same as the mobile experience, but I am saying there's a lot of things Southwest could learn if they did this first, and then they went to the desktop and came up with maybe something like this, right? Which, ironically, was the Southwest Airlines website before this. So I don't know what's going on over there. Somebody got, like, inhaled a lot of pixel dust, right? Does this ever happen to you guys? You inhale too much pixel dust, and all of a sudden you start putting stuff everywhere. And maybe that just happens to me. The other note is, when I show this and this, you know, a lot of the core features are exactly the same. You don't want to rob people of things that they want to do with your product or service just because they're mobile. But there are some things that are specific to mobile. So here you can see this ding fare alerts. That thing probably makes a lot more sense on the go. You want to get alerts sent to you while you're moving throughout the day, and maybe it gets more prominence than it would get here. Okay, so this is focus. You lost 80% of your pixel space. You have to only put the stuff that matters on that screen. And in order to do that, you have to know what really matters, which is good design 101. We can look at another example here that probably you guys are all familiar with. This is Flickr. Chances are you're familiar with Flickr, but you might not be familiar with all of Flickr. In fact, just in the kind of high-level navigation here, there's 60-plus options of things for people to do. When the team built the mobile version, they culled that list down to 8 things. Again, there's a mobile-specific thing, photos taken nearby. But how did they get from these 60 things down to the 8 things? Well, they really had to understand how people are using the site and why, which means they really had to understand their audience. And what are people doing on Flickr? They're checking in on any activity on their photos. They're seeing what their contacts are uploading. They're killing some time by browsing interesting stuff. And then they're, you know, managing their photos and things like that, which is exactly what this little app allows you to do. So there's a really strong focus on how people actually use the site, recent activity, uploads from contacts, interestingness, and then here's all your information at the top there. So if you kind of go through this process first and you work with something that's only 320 by 480 pixels, you get really, really vigilant about what's in here, what's not, what can we take out, because you only have so much room, which forces you to understand what people actually want to do. Past 2 examples I've shown were home screens and intro views, but I also want to show this in action on a content page. So I mentioned I was flying. I ended up booking my trip through Expedia. This is the page on Expedia.com that lists my itinerary. This is the piece of that page that I actually care about. Let me show you that again. This is the page that shows you my itinerary. This is the piece that I actually care about. The entire rest of this page is basically useless to me. It should pixelate and die and get out of there. When you look at the mobile version, it's exactly what I need. Here's the flight, here's when it's leaving, here's where it's leaving from, here's when it arrives. I can move by date, and it'll just kind of move to the next date I have to travel. I can move to the next flight in this trip, right? Up front, nice and big, gives me just what I want and nothing more. So once again, we see this process of this limited screen space very much forcing you to focus on only things that matter. And in this case, getting rid of, I would say, 90% of the things that are on this page, because frankly, they're not actually that important. At least I, as the user of Expedia, have deemed it that way. Now, I've sort of started talking about this here with this notion of we're dealing with 320 by 480 screen size. Those of you that have played with mobile for a while know that this is not entirely true. But if you're going through this process of coming up with a first design and using it to focus in on the actions you want and trying to constrain it to the things that are most important, I find this is actually a pretty good screen size to work with. And I also find it's pretty good to sort of think about it on a device like the iPhone for two reasons. One, the iPhone doesn't have this notion of a menu. Those of you that have an Android device are probably familiar, or if you have a Nokia or even a Palm, you can hit a button and menu and all this other stuff shows up in an application that isn't there before. Whereas on a device like the iPhone, you only have a single home button. You don't have this menu button right here. So what that means is you have to put all your functionality front and center on the page, and same with the web. You don't have, any menu there. It's the same sort of parallel. You sort of have to expose everything. You have to fit everything that matters on that screen. And once again, it's that same constraint of you only have so much space, and there's no miscellaneous bin menu to hide things. Usually these menu things become kind of a crutch. Right? Oh, we really want to put this feature for join latitude on here. All right? Oh, okay, well, just put that in the menu. Yeah. The tab bar has to be visible in the application design. It's not part of the OS. So the menu inside of Android is part of the is like a thing that you can trigger up by calling it through the hardware. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but when you put it inside the iPhone, you have to put it on the screen. The access points to it, the information that's in it has to be visible in that screen because there is no hardware affordance to trigger the menu. Right? So if you're going to you can put a menu control on there, but you have to put that on the screen. Right? There's no default bin that you get for actions, is what I'm saying. Like here, if you wanted to do this, you either would have to have something that says, more actions, or you would literally have to decide whether or not to put join latitude was a link on the screen. So I think the fact that there is this no menu not only forces you to, consolidate and put stuff in and not have a miscellaneous bin, it also forces you to make content the interaction point, which is something that I find really interesting in this whole natural user interface paradigm, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But one of the principles underneath natural user interfaces that seems very compelling and useful is this notion of making the content the action. So you can see this in this iPad app. I saw a bunch of iPads that you guys have. But to use the photos, you open up the stack of photos. There's no button on there. There's no open command. There's no link. You just interact with the photos. And to move the photos, you just slide them. There's no previous and next GUI control. The content itself is the interface. And when you think about some of these principles, stuff like reduce visuals that are not content, content is the UI, have direct interactions with content, working within a canvas where there is no menus or GUIs forces you to kind of think about that. Like, how can I make the content the action? How can I make the interactivity actually be on the things that people are engaging with rather than with menus and controls and buttons and widgets and toggles? Since I mentioned the iPad, some of you might say, hey, that's 1024 by 768. Can we throw all our stuff back in? No. That's just my advice. Another reason why I think if you're going through this process of just working through a design, why thinking about it on this in this 320 by 480 iPhone screen is good. Because if you're working with, and you guys probably are not in this boat, given who I'm talking to, but other people who do consulting, work in different kinds of companies, sometimes the notion of good design isn't as front and center as it could be. But the people that seem to not care about design all of a sudden really care when they're doing something for the iPhone. And I think there's just this bar. So this is an app that somebody made for the iPhone, and these are the Flickr comments on it. My iPhone is crying. Someone take his developer card away, please. This is why Apple shouldn't allow other people to build apps. Right? So there's this expectation that the design has to be good. So when you're going through this process of creating kind of a mobile design first, if you think about it first on the iPhone, then maybe you can beef the design up a little bit, and maybe you can take advantage of the fact that all the content has to be there. But in the real world, you probably don't want to just make an iPhone thing. You may. You have to think about the fact that there's multiple devices out there. So this is 320 by 480. And the other thing that really comes into play that some people are kind of shocked by when they start designing for multiple devices is not just the amount of pixels you have, it's also the PPI, the pixels per inch. So if you've got a 3.5-inch screen, 320 by 480, you're dealing with 164 PPI. The first set of devices that came out of Palm that I'll talk about were really close here. So you're kind of dealing with the same thing. If you built something, it would generally work the same. The first set of Android devices was also pretty much in that same range. The next set of Android devices has really pushed this out. The Nokia smartphones are way over the top in PPI. And the new iPhone that's supposedly coming out June 7th is also supposedly doubling the amount of pixel real estate, which means its PPI is going to shoot up pretty high. And you may be thinking, well, who cares about this? What this means is when you have at 72 pixels per inch, something that looks this big, at 240 PPI, it's going to look that big. So if you're designing for a Nokia N900 and you're doing that on an Apple Cinema display, which has a 94 PPI, your UI looks this big. When you put it on the Nokia, which has a 266 PPI, it looks that big. Right? And I've seen people just get shocked by this because they create these nice visual assets. They try to put it on the device, and it's not working. So working within a vector-based program and scaling things in the context of what the PPI is actually goes a long way. The other important thing to think about for designing for multiple screens, and here I'm quoting a lot of stuff that Brian Rieger put out there because I think he sort of laid this out the best way. When you're doing an actual mobile product, you kind of have to think about, well, what devices are we targeting? And when you nail down which devices you're targeting, you look at the range of screens that are available there, and you can define some device groups. So maybe you end up with 3 ranges, something that's 128 pixels for the screens that are 128 to 164, something that's 165 to 229, and something that's 240 and larger. Or maybe you use these based off this device atlas data. It really depends on the devices you're targeting. That's not this talk. Your device strategy is a whole other conversation we can have. But once you have these groupings, you can begin to create a reference design and then think about how it adapts to these other device groups. And that adaptation probably has some rules in terms of the content and in terms of the actual design, right? So here, when it stretches this way, it's going to get 4. These are actually different assets. There's different adaptation rules that cover through this. And the fourth piece here, which I think should be pretty familiar to everybody, is use good standards and flexible layout. So there's always been this back and forth, fixed grid layout, flexible layout. Now as we have a ton more different devices that are connected to the network, I think the need for flexible layouts is even greater. Just because if something's 40 pixels different, are you going to really create yet another style sheet for that, or are you just going to let it adapt? Adapting is much better. Okay, so limited screen space forces you to focus on what matters, and it forces you to really realize what people want. If you don't know what people want or what they're trying to do or what you're trying to have them do, you don't have that focus. I think as a kind of first run to a design, thinking on the iPhone 320 by 480 screen is good because of that high design level and lack of menu. And if you're going to build for more devices, you've got to deal with multiple screen sizes and densities, and there's some ways of doing that. Okay, next, speed. So anybody have this ever happen to them? Speed matters a heck of a lot on mobile, probably more so than on the desktop. And there's a couple ways to enhance that. This is kind of a summation of some things that Google and a few other folks have been putting out there. But at a high level, send less stuff in terms of file size and requests. But the other one that's a bit more interesting is some of the things you can start to do with HTML5. So HTML5 in WebKit, which is right now on Android and iPhone, BlackBerry's moving to WebKit. They've demoed a WebKit browser. Nokia's got a WebKit browser. The only kind of major smartphone, Palm's running it. The only one that's got a non-WebKit implementation is Microsoft Windows Phone 7, which has a version of Microsoft Internet Explorer 7 with some bits of Internet Explorer 8 in there. which I think is kind of a disaster for them and for just building for the mobile web, because all these nice capabilities you can't use there. So they're going to have a little bit of a decrepit experience. Why they just wouldn't use the free version of WebKit probably amounts to pride and some strategy. So with HTML5, what you can do is load contents lazily. You can use app cache to store some things on the device. And really interestingly, you can use Cascading Style Sheets 3 and Canvas to replace places where you previously were using images. So you start turning that stuff into actual code as opposed to images, and that helps you accomplish point 1 above. The speed, and why I think designing for mobile first is good, another reason. If you have that really tight focus on speed that you need for mobile, you get all those benefits on the desktop. It's not any secret that good performance results in good things on the web in general. I can go and rattle off statistics like this all day about how improvements in speed make things a lot better. There's a new study that Google recently released at a research paper which showed that people that had their performance impacted negatively on purpose by Google, they would go away, but then after 3 and 4 weeks, they would stay away. Right? So it's not a temporary thing that where you reduce their engagement. Their engagement falls off over a long period of time when performance goes down. So if you go through the more hardcore discipline of making it performance optimal on mobile, you get all those benefits on the desktop as well. That's why thinking about it on the mobile platform first forces you to be even more vigilant. Then when you get to the desktop, you already have all that good stuff available to you. So we talked about 2 constraints, screen size and speed. And hopefully I convinced you why those constraints help get you a better product. The last thing here is context. And to illustrate what I mean by mobile context, speaking of Windows Phone, I'm going to play you this little video that they have created that demos the user interface they have in the Windows Phone 7. But I'm not showing it to illustrate their UI. I'm showing it to illustrate the context under which people engage with mobile devices. It's in these small bursts in the context of their everyday, right? So here she's taking a quick photo of a car and sending a text message. The other kid was playing a quick game in the backyard. Now you'll see that he's receiving that message. She's showing some pictures here, and it kind of works like that, right? Those of you that have a device like this are aware of this. And in a bit more detail, 80+% of people use these devices at home. 80% of them use them in miscellaneous times throughout the day. The general story here is short, quick bursts throughout the day. So the reason why I like the mobile context as something to think about first is your mobile's with you all the time. So designing for mobile first means designing for something that is used all the time. You have that opportunity. People aren't in front of their desktop or their laptop all the time. People have their mobile in their pocket with them all the time. And so if you're thinking about designing in that environment, you're thinking about something people will use all the time. In fact, it's these small, quick time-killing tasks that are really blowing up on mobile right now. So you can see things like Facebook and Twitter that always have some kind of new stuff happening and are relevant because your friends are doing things. Those are the things that people continually check in on, spend a minute or two to see what's going on, and they use it throughout the entire day. So these guys are growing like crazy in this mobile context. So if you make things short and bursty, that drives reuse. And I think that's good for mobile and good for web, period. Because if you're designing products to be used many times over and over again, that's going to be good in both cases. And perhaps not ironically, turns out this is how people are using the web anyway, in these short, quick bursts. So this is a study of over 500,000 URIs. And what they showed was that a quarter of those documents were displayed for less than 4 seconds. Over half of the visits were for shorter than 10 seconds, and most visits were 1,000, 1,000, 1,000 long. So that's not a lot of time. In fact, people don't stay long at all, and you probably know this through your own behavior. You jump between sites, check things out, get in, get out. So if you're not designing for that kind of behavior and that kind of context, you're not taking advantage necessarily of how people are actually using the web. And mobile just exponentially magnifies that even further. Somebody standing in line, you got a minute or two, what can you give them to do? The other constraint that comes from mobile is this. Has anybody seen any? Actually, I guarantee you Jeff walks through here like this, right? Does he? Okay, good. Uh, so this sort of one-handed interaction, right? Where you need to have these big, broad, simple actions, which forces you to simplify the UI because there's this touch thing going on. And touch I'm going to talk about as a capability a little bit more than a constraint, but there is some constraint in how you build the user interface so that you can allow people to use things on the go and with their thumb. This kind of one-handed interaction is really important in mobile. So we've looked at growth and constraints, and hopefully I gave you some tips for managing screen sizes, densities, performance optimization, and this need to think about quick, short interactions. The next stuff to talk about is capabilities. And I think mobile has a lot of new capabilities that give you some interesting ideas for innovation. And the first one that I want to talk about is touch. Touch is permeating a whole bunch of major computing platforms. And if you're building for mobile first, you kind of have to think about how are people on a touch-based UI going to interact with our content? Have we made it usable? Have we thought through what those interactions will look like? I'll jump through that real fast. Okay, dark green is how much touch is in Nokia's devices. Nokia has 1.1 billion devices out in 2009, so what they're doing is pretty indicative of what other people are doing. In fact, in 2009, there's 1.03 million touchscreen phones sold per day. So today, there was 100,000 Android phones activated, 97,000 iPhones sold, 35,000 iPads sold, 240,000 smartphones sold by Nokia. So lot of devices that are touch enabled coming out every single day. So if you have a web-based service or you have an application that doesn't think through how to utilize these capabilities, chances are there's an increasing number of people that may have a hard time utilizing it. So let's talk about designing for touch. First thing I want to touch on is touch targets. So you're using your finger, and many of us have kind of the fat finger. So how do you make sure that the controls and the content in these applications can register touch? So Apple, since they're dealing with a single PPI and a single 320 by 480 pixel density or pixel resolution, has a pixel-based recommendation, and that's literally to account for fingers like this. Microsoft goes a little bit further, and they include these millimeters, which when you actually think through getting cross-device pixel-independent resolution, having an actual physical measure of the finger is more important than having any pixel basis for it. And a lot of this stuff comes from studies of fingertips and of kind of how people touch screens. So for example, the MIT found that the average human finger pad is 10 to 14 millimeters, and the average fingertip is 8 to 10 millimeters. So a lot of this data really comes from those types of studies. And between Microsoft and Apple, they're pretty close, right? Apple says 29 high. Microsoft says 44 pixels high, maybe due to their different PPIs. So they also talk about what the minimum spacing between elements should be, what the visual touch size should be, which is a good thing. And there's a couple other things when you should make something bigger than 9 millimeters. If you're touching something frequently, if the result of touching it has a severe error, or if it's located towards the edge of the screen, or, and the more interesting one is if it's part of a sequential task, like hitting a dial pad. That's a good reason to do it. Lastly, I think it gets really interesting to look at how touch targets work under the surface. So Matt Gemmell here has a nice illustration of this. You see this cancel button on the bottom right? So this is the area that will trigger it. If you hit that with your finger, that initiates the cancel action. But this green area, I don't know if you can see the green area here. It's basically this big. If you let go with your finger anywhere inside the green area, you're still going to activate that action. If you move your finger outside the green area without letting go, it'll cancel the action. And so what this basically amounts to is we're moving around, we've got one finger, we're kind of sloppy. It's not the precision click of a mouse. And this gives you some affordability to, mess up a little bit, to slip. And you get this behavior for free if you use native development platforms, but if you're not, it's something to actually think through. Okay, that's touch targets. Those are the areas that register touch-based interactions. What about the gestures themselves? I mentioned at this point we've got a lot of different touch platforms. I should add BlackBerry's RIMS OS 6.0 to this list. That's going to be multi-touch enabled. I should add Ubuntu probably. They just released, believe it or not, a touch-based thing as well. there's a lot of these platforms. They all refer to the interactions people can have with the platform in different terms, but it turns out they all generally support the same kind of core gestures. So what we did an audit of all these different platforms and looked at the gestures that they supported and tried to cluster them into A, common gestures, but then B, organize them by which of those gestures are used for things people are trying to accomplish, whether that's navigating, interacting with objects, dealing with the system. If somebody's trying to accomplish a task, what's a core gesture that applies to that task? So, and the other thing that we did, which I'll talk to you a little bit later, is the visuals have been designed in a way that you can actually use them to annotate designs. They're not designed in a way to illustrate, like a sign language chart, how you make the gesture. Most of these platforms out there like try and show you how to make the gesture through literally a sign language type chart. These are a bit more abstract and targeted towards this is the gesture that's being used in this part of the UI. So what are they? There's touch and multi-finger touch. Then there's double tap. Double tap with multiple fingers is a little weird, so you don't really see that much of it. There's drag, which is you put it down, you move it, and there's flick where you kind of brush it. And drag has multi-finger applications. Haven't seen too many for flick. I'm guessing it's just hard to detect. Pinch and spread. This is sort of also in the multi-touch, multi-finger realm. Press and tap, press and drag. There's a couple of variations on press or drag. It could be two-handed, one-handed. And last but not least, there's a couple of rotational gestures, whether it's a one finger move around or move two in a circle, what have you. So these are kind of the core basic gestures, and then you can start looking at system-related actions. So let's say somebody wants to change modes, or let's say somebody wants to open something. What's the most commonly used touch gesture across these different platforms that supports that? Or somebody wants to interact with an object, like they want to delete something or duplicate something or move something. Across these platforms, what are the gestures that most commonly apply to that? Navigation actions, scrolling, panning, same sort of story. And so we wrapped all this stuff up into a document where you can get all these stencils, you can get all of these actions, see which core gestures apply to it. You can get it online and start using it. So all those are in there. All these different user actions are in there, and there's a listing of all the platforms and what gestures they support. Once you learn this core set of gestures and how they support major actions, then you can start building compound gestures or specialized gestures. So this is a study Microsoft did on their Surface computing platform, where they had people sit down and kind of make the gestures they thought they would do to have the Microsoft Surface do stuff. And these user-defined gestures use a lot of these basic gestures. For example, this uses drag, but it uses it to actually draw things. And there's a series of other things. But once you get these basic gestures down, you can turn specialized gestures on, you can compound them and make use of them that way. So getting back to how touch as a capability can make your web service or site better, in addition just to thinking about how it's going to work with a touch-based UI, which you do if you design for mobile first, right? You sort of get that for free when you move it then over to the desktop, as opposed to you design it for the desktop and the mouse first, and then you don't know if it's going to work for touch. So this is a Yahoo example called Finger Food, and when you open up this page, it detects where you're at, brings up a map, then you can draw either a circle or a line or a square, and it comes back and says, well, here's the places to eat around here. So here, you're using touch as a capability to get input from people, which is kind of interesting and potentially opens up some opportunities for innovation. It's not just these next generation kind of UIs. It's even simple interactions, I think, are ripe for innovation in a touch-based system. So everybody's familiar with these kinds of interactions? They get really fun when there's 50 of them and they're 2 characters long. I've been using computers for a long time, and I still mess these things up. So imagine trying to do that on a thing with your finger, right, on the go, walking down the street. It's next to impossible. So what they've done in these platforms, I'll show the Android and iPhone versions, if you tap that, you get this big scrollable list with really large target sizes. You can flick through that list, and you can tap on the when you want, much more actionable. Same thing on Android. You tap it, you get, in this case, a dialog window. You can scroll through, hit it, and trigger one of these. But it gets even more interesting in terms of UI element innovation, because imagine interacting with 3 of those drop-down menus. Here what they've done is they built a compound input for either height or birthday where you get this kind of dual, what do they call these things, slot machines. And you can flick through 3 of them and just stop them in the appropriate place. And Android has something similar, although I don't like it as much because the interaction isn't as flicky. You can hold it down and it'll move. Otherwise, you're like tap, tap, tapping, which is not as nice. Another important consideration for touch-based interfaces is the fact that there is no hover, at least not yet. There are some patents that kind of detect if your finger's close and maybe it'll trigger a hover. I really hope not. Granted, there's some good things you can do with hovers. Netflix back-of-the-box UI was one of them. You hover over the thing and you can see this information. This has been good, but then since then they've gone a little hover crazy. You like hover over the actions, hover over the buttons, and this stuff goes really too far. So here's Barnes & Noble, right? Try to find something on this page that doesn't have some kind of hover layer. It's next to impossible. And so the reason why when you design for touch and you design for mobile first, you can't use hovers. And the reason why I think doing that is a good thing for the desktop is because hover is not an intentional user action. You're guessing. No matter how good you're guessing that that's what people want, right? Click is user intent, hover is not. And most likely you're going to get it wrong. So I also find that the hover thing is a crutch, like the menu item on the Android phone. Oh, should we put on this page? I don't know. Let's put it in a hover. Okay, we'll just put everything in a hover. Any of you guys interacted with Flickr's new hover cards? Is anybody annoyed by Flickr's hover cards where they cover up everything that you're trying to get to? Oh, Twitter's, sorry. Twitter's hover cards. Anybody interacted with those? Yes, okay, there we go. This doesn't mean that you can't provide some tool tips and things like that in the mobile experience. So this is a Yahoo Finance app. When you open it up, it has this little tool tip that just fades away. So you can still give people tips that you kind of get in a hover, but you just don't do it by detecting where their finger is. Okay, so touch is a great capability. Designing for mobile first forces you to think about how your service is going to work. Location is another one. And I think location is great because on the desktop, this is how I find some place to eat on Yelp. And those of you that live in San Jose know this is a big freaking area to deal with, right? And so what you end up doing is you start interacting with all these filters, and then you're moving the map, and then the map follows you, and it's not as pleasant as it could be. On mobile, on the Yelp mobile app, when you open it up, it defaults to nearby. You just hit restaurants, and voila, there's restaurants that are right next to you. And this sort of instant come-to-me information based on the fact that the device knows your location to a certain degree of accuracy can give you all sorts of great things. So this is where. You open up where it says, hey, here's the cheapest gas near you. Here's the temperature near you. Here's the news near you. When do you want to know what events near you or traffic information near you or pulse near you? You don't have to provide any input. All this stuff just sort of comes to you through the fact that there's this location component. HTML5 capable browsers support native location access. So that's Firefox 3.5, 3.6, iPhone, Safari, Chrome. And older versions using Gears and geolocode and all these things do it. But most mobile platforms actually have all of these, maybe actually all of these available to you, right? In many cases. And the one this is a fact that that I found sort of interesting. 2/3 to 3/4 of the time when the iPhone locates itself, it actually uses Skyhook Wi-Fi geolocation, not GPS. Because GPS, it doesn't work indoors, takes 10 minutes and really drains battery life. So this is sort of a comparison of the way you can get different location info. This is a more detailed comparison of that. The bottom line is that location allows you, assuming you have location available to you when you design your product, creates some really interesting capabilities and ideas. If you're designing for the desktop first, you're going to say, oh, maybe Firefox 3.5 has it. I don't really have location. So you're not going to think about how your product can use it. If you design for mobile first, it's there. And then in the browsers that support it, you'll get it. And in the other ones, I guarantee over time, they're going to start supporting it more and more, right? So capability on the mobile device, designed for mobile first, you get to use it. And then when the desktop catches up, you can start applying it there. So I've talked about a few interesting capabilities that fall in that realm, right? Available to you on mobile, probably going to make their way to desktop. Talked about app cache, talked about Canvas, CSS3, multi-touch sensors, location detection, but there's a whole bunch more. And I'm going to touch on a few really, really fast. But orientation is another capability. So this is an Android Mail UI. flip it, what are you going to do? Make the UI the same, or give people more room and move the button over so it actually becomes a better experience when people shift the position of the device? The iPad in particular touts the fact that there is no orientation. And a lot of web pages, when they're in this 764 by 1024 mode, they're at the top of the screen and everything else is blank. They look really awkward. But it's not just about looking awkward. There's also a bunch of capabilities that you can start thinking about. So this is the Little. It's a netbook that flips, and it flips into easel mode. And when it flips into easel mode, any application can take advantage of that. So you can create a different UI when somebody's doing this. Does anybody use the laptop in the kitchen to cook? Yeah, terrible, right? You sort of position it on the counter, and you hope you don't get things splattered over it, and you're reading the text. What if you could just flip the orientation and the text gets big and it goes step by step and it has a really big button to move through things? Or this sort of mode, right? There's some of this stuff's funny, but this capability right now is in Firefox 3.6. And this is like a silly little developer demo. But I do think as you get more and more devices that are connected to the network that know which direction they're facing, you can start thinking about how am I going to change my UI based on the orientation? And can I create a more compelling experience, like for the kitchen mode, or for the working mode, or what have you? And when you design for mobile first, you have that capability. You can think about it. It'll get to the desktop at some point. But orientation is not limited to the device. It can also be used to detect the orientation somebody's facing. So we talked about location. A digital compass or a magnometer tells you the location, the direction you're facing as well. So that allows you to do things like this, which had I shown this slide 2 years ago, people would have laughed at me and said this is science fiction BS. But Yelp, I mentioned before, has this augmented reality kind of like Easter egg that you can use to kind of look like a nerd on the street by positioning it where you want. Jeremy Stoppelman said they kind of put this out as an experiment, as an Easter egg, and they had no idea how interesting it would be, but the people that use it and have found it have boosted their sustained traffic by 40 to 50%. So I have a whole other talk about how augmented reality UIs are really crappy and need to change, but there's something there. There's really something there about layering digital information in the context at which you're viewing the world right now. And I think there's a lot more interesting things to happen there. So that's sensors being used for input with gestures, drawings, location, orientation. There's also audio. This is the Nexus 1. And the Nexus 1, anytime there's an input field, you can hit a button and you can provide audio input into it, or you can just swipe the keyboard. So when you're searching on Amazon, when you're typing in status on Facebook, those are all the examples that are shown in this video. You can provide audio input. Google is actually going pretty hog wild with all these different input formats on mobile. So Google Goggles is another app on Android. Take a picture of a product, get back info. Take a picture of a wine label. Take a picture of a business card. It'll OCR the details, put it into your address book. Take a picture of a work of art. It'll look it up for you. It'll use location plus an image you take to identify landmarks. They recently released this OCR for foreign language translation. So take a picture of Schmadendufferl and Hurendif and learn that that's sour cream cake with elderberry sauce. This is experimental, but it starts to point, on the mobile, you have the capability of integrated audio and video. What are you going to do with it, right? You don't have that on the desktop necessarily because you got to get the webcam or you got to detect or what have you. Can you make your product or experience better by assuming this capability is there and dealing with it later? And there's more. Real-time notifications, device connections, proximity, RFID stuff I'm really excited about, which is essentially detecting digital identity broadcasts. We can talk about that later. But to wrap it up, I think there's a compelling case for doing the mobile version first, even if you just treat it as a design exercise for a day where you sketch out what the mobile version could be, you brainstorm about having these capabilities ahead of you, and then you go and see if any of that can apply to the desktop. I still think it's worth it just to do that because it forces you to focus, because you have small screens, slow connections in this mobile context. It gets you to innovate because you have all these new capabilities available to you. Location, orientation, audio, visual, touch, a lot more. And if you do go ahead and actually build it out, you can take advantage of this huge opportunity in mobile, not just to get on the mobile wave, but to make your overall service better, right? How does this integrate with the desktop experience and the TV experience, the mobile experience? And then hopefully I gave you some design considerations on multiple screen sizes, densities, performance optimization, and doing what Adam says. If you're interested in more information, you can reach me, like I said, on the Twitters, on the liners, and in case you care about web forms, you can buy it cheap. I wrote a book on that. So thanks. I'll stick around for questions.
You mentioned HTML5.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, how about, I think it's VGS or something like that. How does it compare?
How does what?
VGS, it's like vectors, but on...
Oh, SVG.
SVG, sorry.
Yeah, I don't think SVG is really going very far right now. There was a lot of chatter around it for quite a while, but I don't think it's where it could be, right? I think the thing that people are sort of flocking to right now, from what I see, is Canvas, which does similar sorts of things.
So do you have any reasons for that?
Why? Well, originally SVG required this big plugin from Adobe, and I don't think anybody actually went through and implemented it native into the browser as effectively as it could, and it didn't really spread. So I'm guessing that's why, right? Like Canvas is sort of part of WebKit, the browser itself. It doesn't require a plugin, but not that familiar with SVG history. Yeah. Yeah, so one of the reasons I actually like mobile is because advertising isn't a great opportunity in there right now, which means you have to create a service that's valuable enough that people will actually either pay for or has a real business model and that you're selling something, or there's these sorts of things. However, that said, there is a lot of innovative stuff with advertising happening using the same capabilities that I was talking about, right? So having location, having these audio-visual inputs, having these adjustments through all the sensors in the device. I've seen some pretty interesting examples. I don't think, personally, that the smaller size banner ad on mobile is very interesting. I think instead, using these same capabilities and trying to think about how to do a good advertising experience. Yahoo, when I was there, created this thing for Subway that I thought was actually pretty cool. It was Subway sponsored the fantasy football app, and there's a little Subway button. And when you hit it, it would tell you kind of the Subways near you, and you could get a special, and you could see kind of what the menus were and that kind of stuff. So it wasn't very intrusive, and it actually gave you something valuable. Because chances are, if you're watching football with your friends, you might want to get a bunch of Subway sandwiches. If that's how you roll, I don't know. You guys could be a nacho crowd. Yeah.
So let's say you want to create a mobile app and think about mobile first.
Mm-hmm.
And the immediate question would be like, say, are you considering like using iPhone and using a lot of gesture, or using like say WebKit to support say Android, iPhone, etc. So what's your advice to like to make the best decision?
Yeah. Mobile app versus mobile web.
Yep.
Yeah. So the short answer I have on this is if you need the capabilities of the OS, you should build a mobile app. If you want the distribution that comes with an app store, you should build a mobile app. Other than that, you should build mobile web. And the capabilities, like for example, the LinkedIn thing has that kind of little handshake gesture, right? You can't do that without building an app. So if that's an important feature for your application, which hopefully, seems interesting. I don't know. Yeah, the in-person Bluetooth connectivity. You can't do that in the mobile web, right? You have to do that through the app. So if you have those kinds of features, build a mobile app. And then the other thing is, if you want the distribution that the App Store provides, you should build a mobile app. But right now, I think the most engaged platform is the iPhone app platform. The Android app platform is kind of a ghetto-ish experience. I'm sorry if you guys love it. That's been my experience, right? It's not as robust an ecosystem for developers nor for consumers yet. There are some interesting apps in there, but it's not there.
Sorry, one more question. So when you said you mentioned when you want distribution, so for the from the App Store, you went for mobile app. But how about how would you compare that to mobile web? Just because you can just use it, right? So distribution wise,
it's more of marketing and merchandising. Right? Right now, the user behavior is to go to the App Store and find something. They're not yet at the state where they'll go to the web to go and find something to put onto their desktop.
But isn't that sort of dangerous? Because most of the time, your app is probably gonna be buried in like tons of other apps. If you cannot make it to the featured list, you are pretty much doomed.
At least it's available in search, and it's available in categories, and it comes in with the mechanics of sharing and tell a friend that the App Store has. So I'm not saying it's great for discoverability, but it's a channel that you can try and take advantage of to get your app in front of people. And for certain companies, it works better than others. There's a whole bunch of like interesting techniques that people go through for app merchandising. There's applications that change their icon all the time to try and get different kinds of attention. There's ones that change their names sort of as they go around. If you follow like the updates you get from applications, sometimes you'll see the same app change its icon every time it does an update, and they're doing it for these like pseudo promotional merchandising techniques. Yeah.
Don't know anything about mobile apps. The question about are mobile apps, in the way you described it, throwing up new requirements for the mid-tier or for the back-end server-side design?
Yeah, I'm sure in some cases they can, but a lot of this.
Is it just a matter of scalability and high network bandwidth, or is there something special we need to think about?
Yeah, it depends on the capability you're trying to build for. So I'm guessing that the Bluetooth thing happens inside the app, and then you guys are using the same back end to make the connection between two people on LinkedIn, right? Yeah. I sort of have a fundamental belief that a lot of the capabilities that take off in mobile will make their way to the desktop, right? So like location is an example of that. Push notifications, we've already seen a couple browsers having demos of supporting push inside the browser. So many of these capabilities will ultimately make their way to the browser if they're interesting in that context. So if you build capabilities for it in the back end, then you can support it in the browser. I think it was either Mozilla or Chrome that showed push notifications in the browser recently. Can't remember which one. Yeah.
So if you were going to give a star rating for the LinkedIn app on the iTunes Store, what would you give it and why?
So I don't do star ratings for applications on the spot like that. I will say that the LinkedIn mobile application has been getting progressively better over time. My fundamental concern with it right now is, if I can show you my screen, I have a red dot on it that says 1,003 things to do. So I have 1,000 things to do on LinkedIn mobile. I don't have that many 2-minute bursts throughout my day. So that's my personal concern. How many of those? What? Not 1,000 of them. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.